In this video, I'm looking at the costumes from House of the Dragon Episode 7, titled Driftmark, but I also want to touch on some of the costumes from previous episodes. Before I proceed, there will be spoilers for HBO's House of the Dragon and some mild book spoilers too. I'm going to start with the color palette because this has been a pretty consistent thread throughout the entire season so far, and of course, it'll eventually culminate in the divisions of the factions, as we will likely see by the penultimate episode or the season finale. Let's start with Lena Valarian's funeral at Driftmark. All of the key players are there, and we see the tensions building. In Westeros, the traditional color for mourning is black, like we saw in the costumes worn at Queen Emma's funeral. But it's interesting to see that except for Lena's daughters Rhaena and Baela, no one is in black, and most of the players like Viserys and Rhaenyra, Corlys and Rhaenys are in versions of their house colors. Meanwhile, Alicent and her children are in shades of green, while Otto is dressed in blue-green. I thought that the decision not to dress the cast in black could be for budgetary reasons, and because the episode was so dark, it wasn't completely obvious to the audience what colors they were wearing. In the previous episode, The Princess and the Queen, Aegon and Aemond were dressed in forest green gambesons, while Helena was dressed in a soft rose gown, a youthful color suited for a princess. In Game of Thrones, Cersei often dressed her children in Lannister colors of red and gold, or at least versions of those colors, despite her illegitimate children being presented as Baratheon. So here, while Helena is dressed in rose, a softer hue of the Targaryen palette, Alicent dresses her boys in her faction color of green. Like Robert Baratheon, King Viserys is completely oblivious. Juxtapose this for Rhaenyra's children dressed in her house colors of red and black, despite her boys, at least in name only, being the children of Lena Valarian. This is in keeping with what Rhaenyra told Jace when he asked if he was a bastard. She told him that he is a Targaryen, and that is all that matters. In color theory, by the way, green is the complementary color of red. One outlier in the show is Larys Strong, and I thought this was important. He has abandoned the House Strong colors of red, blue, and green in favor of wearing a shade of purple. I had even thought it appears to be Tyrian purple, which is a reddish-purple natural dye produced from the mucus by predatory sea snails found in the Mediterranean Sea. According to the History Network, it took as many as 250,000 mollusks to yield just 1 ounce of usable dye, but the result was a vibrant and long-lasting shade of purple. Because the Tyrian purple, or Phoenician red, as it's sometimes called, is so expensive, the color is often associated with royalty, nobility, luxury, power, and ambition. And if you are a comic book fan, purple is often tied to villainy. Now let's talk a little bit about the details of the costumes. I think that Viserys' costume was one of the best. As I mentioned on social media, he might be falling apart and perhaps some dementia is beginning to set in, but his costume is just gorgeous and his outfits are a highlight for me in the series. There is some beautifully detailed embroidery on his cloak, and I love the heavily weighted fasteners. When the still pictures were released before we got the first teaser for House of the Dragon, I did a detailed analysis of the costumes worn by Corlys, Damon, Rhaenyra, Alicent, and Otto. I'll leave the playlist in the description if you want to check them out. Seeing them here in action helps quite a bit. As Tatiana mentioned in our last live stream, I thought that Rhaenyra's costume looked better in the show than in the still images. I'm still not entirely sold on the silhouette, especially given that we don't have any structure in the gown or undergarments. However, I did enjoy seeing that she was wearing hose. I've loved most of Alicent's costumes, but the construction of this one is not my favorite. A viewer asked me if she is pregnant, but I think it's that she has this unfortunate inverted box pleat just below the waist that isn't very flattering, and in combination with the bust darts, the bodice looks a bit saggy. But I've changed my mind about her gown fabric. I originally didn't like the wet look of this clock fabric from Joel & Sons, but I've now dubbed it her slippery when wet dress because at this juncture, Alicent is as slippery as an eel. This ties in nicely with Larys' snake in the grass persona. I noticed that the scale on his costume is the same scale fabric worn by Cersei Lannister, but in a different color. I had called this her rotting from within costume. Larys also has a reptilian-type texture on the front of his costume. Both Cersei and Joffrey wear similarly scale-type fabrics in Season 1. I'm enjoying the callbacks to the original series, even if they weren't intentional. And while Redditors and such were quick to point out that the insect in his cane and the brooch worn by his assassins feature a firefly, I noticed that his buttons feature what looks more like a common housefly. As one of my viewers stated, perhaps he is a fly on the wall. In episode 7, Damon has returned to a more Westerosi long-line doublet made from a brocade fabric from Top Fabric of Soho. Having left behind the Pentoshi style that we saw in the previous episode, that jacket was made from vintage fabrics according to the costume designer Jany Temime. If you recall, Pentos is where we first met Daenerys Targaryen and her brother Viserys while they are living in exile. They were clothed and housed by the Pentoshi magistrate Illyrio Mompatis. Why I mention this is Damon's color palette and the use of silver in his dragon fasteners on his jacket and the jewelry worn at the funeral is aligned with the costumes worn by Daenerys in later seasons. The majority of the royal party wear gold accents, fasteners, and jewelry, but I thought it was interesting that Rhaenyra's boys by Harwin also wear silver. I like the costume worn by Sir Carl Corey. I liked how Damon called it out because he is one of the finest dressed characters in the episode. And his paramour Lena has just a hint of a puff sleeve, a detail that I enjoyed. One of my favorite parts of the costume design in this episode was the wedding between Damon and Rhaenyra. While we knew it was coming, I appreciated that they were able to keep their wedding costumes under wraps because up until now, everything has been released before the episode airs. Costume designer Jany Temime said in a behind-the-scenes video that these costumes were one of the most difficult because she couldn't go bigger than what they had done for Rhaenyra's wedding. So they went by way of old Valyria instead, costumes that would have been created before the Targaryen dynasty. Her inspiration was the kimono-like silhouette of the Dragon Keepers as seen in the first episode, Rhaenyra and Damon's costumes mirroring each other. The designer wanted the red blood element, which was tie-dyed and hand-printed onto the fabric, and then the costumes were aged. I will call out one thing that they said, however, that the costumes are meant to be thousands of years old. Perhaps they meant that they were inspired by Valarian costumes from thousands of years ago? Earlier, I had mentioned the callback to Game of Thrones, and as you might recall, many of the gowns and clothing worn in court under Robert Baratheon and later Joffrey Baratheon were kimono-inspired. During this series, I had a conversation with YouTuber The Dragon Demands, where we believed that in show canon, this likely came from the Targaryen dynasty, since Tywin Lannister served as Hand of the King under Mad King Aerys Targaryen. Rhaenyra's headpiece also appears to be inspired by the traditional Russian kokoshnik. These examples of 19th century Russian headpieces are from the ROM in New York. I mentioned this in one of my very first videos on this channel, but the nagajuban, or kimono underwear, and the kimono itself must be worn left over right. Only dead people have their kimonos worn right over left. So in the Game of Thrones universe and House of the Dragon, they are wearing their kimonos like the dead. Take what you will from that. We will be doing a House of the Dragon livestream reaction this coming Tuesday at 7 p.m. EST, following the episode The Lord of Tides. I hope you can join us. I will leave a link below. Thank you for spending time with me. I'll see you in the next video.